As the year 1775 dawned, it was clear that tensions were growing and the situation in the colonies was getting notably worse. The colonists began to form an assembly to meet and talk and present demands to the British government. It became known as the Continental Congress. And in the meantime, fearing that the British troops were going to eventually just fully occupy the colonies, colonists began to collect arms and hoard them in anticipation of potential physical conflict with the British. They couldn't, of course, store those arms in the city of Boston since it was under occupation, and so many of these arms were brought to the cities of Lexington and Concord, villages that are about 25-30 miles to the west-northwest of Boston, and they were housed there waiting for when they were going to be needed. The British, recognizing that there was danger in this, feeling that they had to confiscate those guns, decided it was time to go out and collect them before it was too late. It is that action that generated, of course, the famous riot of Paul Revere, in which he announced that the British were coming, one if by land, two if by sea, and so on. What, of course, they don't like to talk about is the fact that Paul Revere actually never made it to Lexington or Concord to warn them. He was stopped at the city limits of Boston and never made it to warn anybody. It was the other riders that actually made it and let them know that the British were on their way. Nonetheless, what ended up happening was that at 5 o'clock in the morning, the British troops reached the village of Lexington. They met on the village green in the center of town, where they were confronted by a group of angry colonists hurling rocks at them, calling them threatening names, and so on. The troops panicked and fired on the crowd, killing a group of colonists, and thus firing what became known as the shot heard round the world, really the first shots, arguably, of what became the American Revolution. The troops then moved on, and at 9:30 in the morning, 96 British troops approached the village of Concord. To get to Concord, they had to cross this large field and a bridge, a narrow bridge at the far end of that field, which crossed a small stream or river. In that field, the troops were confronted by a group of about 400 colonists, many of them again bearing arms and threatening the British troops. As they crossed the bridge and crossed the field and approached the bridge, they had to funnel down into a narrow line, and alongside that bridge, hiding behind the trees and among the rocks, were a group of colonists who then opened fire and killed 8 of the British troops. The troops, of course, responded in kind, firing on the crowd, killing more colonists, and so the battle had been joined with casualties now on both sides. The British again failed to get any arms. They had been cleared out. By 1776, it was clear that things were about to explode. Tensions were continuing to grow. The colonists saw no real viable solution to the confrontations with the British, and it was in the beginning of 1776 that this gentleman, Thomas Paine, published a famous pamphlet called Common Sense. Paine was a relatively new immigrant to America, had come from Europe, a well-educated guy, and he argued that England was to be detested for the actions they had taken, that it was time for the Americans to end this tyranny, to declare their independence, and create a society that would give equal social and economic opportunity for all. This pamphlet, Common Sense, was an immensely influential pamphlet. It gives you some idea to tell you that over 500,000 copies, 500,000 copies of Common Sense sold in the spring of 1776 throughout the American colonies. This in a society that only consisted of a few million people at most anyway, most of whom were at best semi-literate, not reading books, not capable of understanding and reading along with something of this complexity. And yet, nonetheless, this became the bestseller of the first half of 1776, stirring the people and raising them to the idea of potential action. And so, as the